that we will think about a few of the scenarios we've seen in 2020, this very unusual year. But I also hope that the ideas and the discussion that we can have together at the end of this call might be a stimulus for us all as a collective to think about designing the future of data governance. And I recognize many of you on this call. In fact, I'm well aware that some of you I have worked with in the past or now work with. And I also know that you're intelligent, experienced, opinionated at times people. And so rather than have a Q&A at the end where I'm the focus of the discussion, I would really welcome and ask you to think about throughout this presentation, what are your ideas about how we move governance forward in response to the sorts of things we've seen in this past year? So be ready. I do have a disclaimer, in fact, two, as you can imagine. Being that I work for KPMG, I'm here in that capacity. I am an employee of KPMG. However, I'm not representing an official KPMG perspective on these matters. Again, this is very much a thought piece to get us all talking. Likewise, as mentioned by Andrew, I do have a role right now contracted into Defence, and it's very important for everybody to understand that I don't actually speak on behalf of the Defence Force, nor the Department of Defence. So consequently, if you are coming to this event loaded with questions about Defence, I'm afraid I won't be able to answer those. So a little bit about me. I think you probably saw the bio when signing up for the event. But those that know me well would probably call me a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none. I certainly don't see myself as a privacy expert or a governance expert or really an expert in anything. But I do have a career that has been at the intersection of people and technology, and the ethics of how technology can serve or might even master us as the human race. So the area that I work in within KPMG is called Digital Delta, and very much focused on artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, cognitive compute, and various other different emerging technologies, and the impact that they can have on us as a society, but also our enterprises and our organisations, our governments and our citizen services. So I'm actually quite a private person. I don't like doing these sorts of things, to be honest. I only really use social media for professional purposes or in very small networks. And even though I was one of the very early adopters, for example, of Facebook, by 2012, I deleted my account as much as it's possible. And here's an example of why, and it speaks to this concept of agile governance. So I'd spent more than a decade working with the pharmaceutical industry in Europe and America. And I'd been helping them to reframe the concept of trust, because pharmaceutical companies do have issues around trust and reputation. And the idea was to engage directly with patients, which was quite a significant shift back then in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s. And some of you may know that the pharmaceutical industry is highly regulated. So any initiative that you can think of that might engage with patients requires lawyers, it requires medical advisors, there's pharmacovigilance and compliance and regulatory. And so a lot of signatories required to get something across the line that will not bring the company or the industry into disrepute. And so we worked with one company to develop a health awareness campaign. It was across many languages, across lots of countries in Europe. And the idea was patients all over the world are suffering or living with chronic pain. And they don't really feel understood. So we thought, let's join them up, let's create a community and let's give them the opportunity to share their story. So this took, as you can imagine, quite an effort to get these approvals across the line. And then finally we did it, and it was transformative. Then Facebook went and changed their features. They changed some of their privacy settings, and everything we'd worked for was no longer compliant. There was no way to use those previous approvals to assure that what we were doing was in fact appropriate to the industry. Not only that, and this was the real kicker, on a Christmas day, as I was monitoring the performance of the campaign, one of the third-party social platforms was hacked. And it was discovered that all of the participants' usernames and passwords were stored in plain text, unencrypted. So now the consortium of pharmaceutical companies and stakeholders, advocacy groups and others, had to be part of a campaign to communicate with each and every individual about this breach. And it was a very tough lesson in the vulnerabilities of online engagement. So yes, since last year, I've been working with Defence as the Chief Health Information Officer, at least interim, I should say. And that work has been fascinating. I couldn't have imagined that we would be in this year looking at bushfires and now a global pandemic. But the office that I work in seek to accelerate innovation and continuous improvement through the use of data and analytics in support of the Australian Defence Force Surgeon General. But on the other hand, we're all very conscious that we're health information stewards, and so we need to mitigate risk and generally err on the side of caution. So that creates a great tension, and I expect that many of you on this call also feel that tension between innovation and also making sure that we don't bring undue risk. So to help set the scene for our conversation today and to get you thinking, I want to take you on a journey of imagination. So some of you may have heard the expression fair weather sailing. And this means that when the going is good, you are bold and adventurous and nothing will stop you. And so I want you to imagine right now that you're absolutely fed up with the system. And by system, I mean capital S, the whole system. You've had enough. You've decided to buy a sailing boat, you're paid in cash, and now you want to disappear off the face of the earth. You see, for some time you've been thinking to yourself, why should anyone know anything about me or what I'm doing? Seems fair enough. So your strategy is, I want to survive, but you've decided that the entire adventure will be old school and off the grid. So you're going to use paper charts, you'll have a sextant, a ruler, a watch. There's going to be no GPS trackers for you, no Google Maps, and none of the latest technology. So for a couple of weeks, you're doing really well. Everything's fantastic. Sailing down the coastline of Australia, stopping wherever you like. Above all, not having to tell anyone what you're doing or why you're doing it. But one day, the skies turn dark and a squall begins to envelop you. And you're tossed and turned by a relentless sea. And then the boat capsizes and sinks. Too bad, so sad. Actually, you're probably panicking and you're thinking, but no one knows where I am. Help, help. But fortunately, in some moment of carelessness, you did somehow end up with a life jacket with all the mod cons. There's shark repellent, a light, a whistle, and above all, a safety beacon that starts pinging the moment you are fully immersed in water. And you start thinking to yourself, thank goodness, they're going to know where I am, as you struggle not to consume another mouthful of seawater. So after a long and tiring night of wild weather, you've somehow drifted in and out of consciousness, yet you've stayed alive. You didn't get eaten by sharks. Fortunately, the water was warm enough that you didn't get hypothermia. And as morning dawns, you hear and see a helicopter. The Australian Maritime Safety Authority have located your beacon and dispatched rescue divers. And they're calling out to you from the water to get your attention and keep you alert. They notice you're about to lose consciousness. What's your name? They yell out. And you reply, not sure if you're in a dream. And the next thing you know, you're spinning around as you ascend through the air. As you grab hold of the helicopter skid, One of the paramedics inside starts asking you all sorts of personal questions about your date of birth, your allergies, medical history, and more. And you tell her everything because you know that your very life depends on it. So I trust the story wasn't too traumatic, but trust is very important when it comes to consent. And one of the things about consent that strikes me, and probably all of us on the call, is that we really think of it as a very Boolean construct. It's one thing or another. It's a defining gesture that gives permission by the rule of law. Yet that previous storyline had no forms to fill in. You were stridently obtuse and a privacy conscious person during the fair weather. And yet now, towards the end, you're suddenly gushing with sensitive personal health information in another situation. So the point that I'm making here through this story is that the scenario changes the context of consent. So any urgency or benefit or inconvenience is overshadowed by an imperative to survive on an individual personal level. So, you know, for example, as you're coming into the helicopter, you're not asking questions like, do I trust this person? Or how do I know she's a medic? And anyway, what's a security clearance if you work in government? And they would normally be pretty important questions if you're doing governance and if you've got the luxury of time. But the context provided the assurance of legitimacy. And so you didn't question these people that were there to help you survive. And this comes back to our title slide. When lives depend on data, consent is often implied. So there's a lot of black and white text that makes up our terms and conditions on our websites and in our contractual agreements. And I think we all know that terms and conditions are often not really for the benefit of the individual, the consumer. They're more likely for the protection of the entity collecting the data. And so when humans make decisions, they instead tend to weigh up benefits versus risks. And sometimes they resort to patterns from past experience. But with that said, have you ever seen on any service, or even something that you've developed yourself, a simple pros versus cons debate on which you could make your decision about consent? Instead, a lot of the words that we use are really conditions and loopholes to prevent litigious consequences. We don't want to get sued. And often the checkboxes for consent amount to, I have read and agreed, ... So I'll give you another example that brings this to life, and it's very real from my own personal life. I purchased a smart television several years ago. I was pretty pleased with myself. Took it home, started to set it up, and diligently read the terms and conditions for every option. And I very deliberately made the selections that were appropriate to my personal preference. So I complete the whole process. The setup assistant tells me, due to your selection, the smart features of this television cannot be enabled. So I was furious. Felt like going back to the shop and saying, your smart TV is not compatible with my privacy preferences. So perhaps you should give me a discount. I'd like half off, thanks. So more importantly, my election of preference didn't actually result in a graceful degradation of service. It was literally all or nothing. So I had an expensive, dumb TV until I finally caved in and ticked all the boxes and gave away my privacy. And I think this is the tension that consumers face much of the time. Our citizens face this same tension. And I feel like we could say that we are sometimes not blatantly, but by design, coerced into data submission rather than being provided with a mechanism that can help me to be both informed and to make really considered choices. So it's not that easy to really understand data governance when you're a consumer. So if you can, just think for a moment about different programs or applications that you've been involved in designing or implementing. You covered your bases. You know, what you did was you made sure that you weren't going to cause a problem for the organization. You tried to make it as frictionless as possible, and you looked for ways to get the best possible outcome. And that outcome might have been the maximum number of users of your mobile app, or it might have been something else that was a strategic objective, and you've looked for the way in the law or in your protocols or in your terms and conditions to achieve your outcome, but really not with consumers being any the wiser. So I don't think it's black and white. It really is a spectrum, and hence the introduction to this talk. So I don't actually rarely find anyone who has exactly the same choices and thinking about choices that I have, because as you would expect, there should be many variables and factors that go into why you choose to do something or to not do something. But our entities are not yet, and by entities I mean organizations, departments, companies, businesses, we're not yet really able to cope with variables or permutations and combinations. We want to make it as simple as possible, and that's why we keep going back to this black and white. And probably you've heard the quote that Henry Ford said back in 1909, I think it was, to a salesman: any customer can have a car painted any color that he wants, so long as it is black. And so it's important as a stimulus for our conversation later on to remember that very few of us think exactly the same way about privacy considerations and data governance. So here's one example. When you enlist in the elite shock troops or space marines of the Galactic Empire under the leadership of Emperor Palpatine and his commanders, you probably sign a lot of forms to waive your rights. You rarely see that in the feature films, but I'm pretty sure that's what happens. You ultimately accept the risk that you might die in service of your nation or your planet or your empire, whatever the case may be. But there's inevitably a lot of forms. So my question to you, does the 18-year-old kid who wants to be a stormtrooper know what I agree to the privacy policy means? Is their definition of privacy even the same as me, who might be designing a system of consent? But in return, the kid is thinking about the benefits, such as a guaranteed paycheck, I'm going to have an education, I'm going to get advanced and specialty training, I'll have paid vacations, I get to travel the universe, and then I've got options for full-time or part-time, there might be some tax-free board and allowances, and not only that, I'm going to get a cool suit of armor, and apparently now these suits of armor can even fly. So great, sign me up. But I think really, you also hope that when you give yourself across to a system, you hope that system is going to look after your health and well-being. It's going to look after you generally. You're trusting that that organization is doing everything it can with your data to make you the best version of yourself, or potentially to save your life if it really came down to that. So that's on the spectrum of consent. That's one end, which is I give you my data and I trust you'll use it. In fact, I want you to use it. I want you to exploit it to the max. I want you to massage and augment the data, but above all, do no harm. Please look after me. That's the point. Now let's contrast that on the spectrum to the general public. It's almost the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So people, humans, the general pop, gen pop, if you like, we're volatile, we're unpredictable, or maybe predictably unpredictable. So all of us are happy to have a driver's license, I think. We're pretty happy to have a Medicare card, no problems. But apparently, historically, not okay to have an Australia card. That was just an absolute impingement on privacy, according to the general public. And so over decades of conditioning, we've kind of, as society, developed this palpable mistrust of government, of organizations, of systems that the powers that be might want to use our own personal data against us. And that was pretty evident, I think, for those of us in Australia when the My Health Record, which is Australia's personally controlled electronic health record, moved from what was previously an opt-in model, actually registering to have a record, to an opt-out model, which is to say everybody's going to get a record unless you say you don't want one. And I actually worked with My Health Record, or with the Australian Digital Health Agency, and I saw firsthand just vitriolic commentary from the Australian public concerning their mistrust of government. And it was partly because they thought there was some malicious attempt to increase revenue. Some of them thought that we were providing a means for the police or employers to seize information without a warrant. There was fears of discrimination, that this would be used to, separate groups of or cohorts of people. And in some cases, I think probably fairly, just a concern that ineptitude or incompetence might result in your most sensitive secrets being revealed to hackers or worse. Now, as a person on the inside, I can say hand on heart that I never witnessed any evidence of ill intent or malicious Machiavellian strategy to con the Australian people. But I will admit, the astute privacy advocacy groups and other individuals did find that the legislation as it was didn't explicitly prevent such things from happening. And in my opinion, and it's a personal opinion, there are some overarching boilerplate provisions that exist in government legislation that, when they're applied to different respective acts, don't really raise any eyebrows, but particularly did raise eyebrows in the context of sensitive health information. I was very pleased, as I'm sure all of you were, that the government immediately did the right thing, really, by writing into an amendment the appropriate assurances, providing a mechanism for people to completely delete their record. And I guess I was proud that democracy had produced something that was ultimately flexible, but it was better. It was an agile approach to getting the right policy that serves the people in a way that's appropriate to the need at hand, but also understanding the idiosyncrasies of us as humans. But one side of it that many people didn't see is just how awful some people really are. And I know we've all heard of trolls on the internet and so forth, but I did have a team that was responsible for handling ministerial correspondence and streams of social media and online engagement. And some of the things that were said by the Australian public to these people, deliberately to them as individuals as well, were just, I mean, first of all, I can't say them, but secondly, I can't unhear them or I can't unthink them. They're just awful. But I think recognizing that that's a symptom of people's fear or how important personal privacy is to them, that tells us a lot about this issue. And we can't just assume that the majority will come along with us on the ride. And even if we have done consultation, there's always pockets that will dissent or object or just plain distrust or mistrust. So we've then got these same people that are really concerned about privacy actually using Facebook or Instagram or WhatsApp and out there giving away their information through loyalty cards and whatnot. So this is why I talk about the spectrum of consent as a stimulus for our thinking and conversation. It really changes depending on the person, and it also changes depending on the situation. So 2020 has been an absolutely, well, I didn't want to say it, but unprecedented year. And some of you may have seen these charts going around. This one's just straight from Google Trends, that there is a unprecedented use of the word unprecedented, fortunately dropping off now, which may mean that things are turning a corner. But on a serious note, we actually saw through the Black Summer just a tragedy to our wildlife, to properties, to businesses, and of course human lives that were lost as a result of wildfire. And crowds of holiday goers and residents, as you know from the news, were huddled on beaches under blackened skies with absolutely nothing. They're kind of wondering what they're going to eat. They're wondering where they're going to sleep and whether they're going to have a home to go home to return to, I should say. And these displaced persons are thrown from the privacy of their own safe little world and into a world where they're dependent on others for everything. And these crowds are from all walks of life. Some of them may have even been the vitriolic trolls that were typing on their keyboards from the basement in regards to My Health Record. But collectively, when they saw a Royal Australian Navy ship come into the harbour to bring support and to evacuate survivors, I think a majority would gladly sign a form to accept the risk of going onto what is essentially an industrial environment, or getting into a plane and having to wear a helmet, or to receive medical treatment or more. So the consent in a case of survival, when lives depend on data, all our routine policies and laws quite possibly are not fit for purpose. And this is the challenge to us on the call today, is to think about these scenarios. And I think, you know, the usual and deliberate way of creating law or policy is to draft and to consult and to iterate and debate and revise. And ultimately we have our parliament, both houses, coming to a consensus. But as we saw over summer, if the world is on fire, that's just too slow. I'm sorry, it's too slow. And so we saw it. We saw in times of crises, the government and people looking for quick fix solutions. They're looking for reliable solutions, and naturally we saw the Defence Force get involved as well. Not to say that all the states and jurisdictions were not already doing great work, or the volunteers or the emergency services. It's just it was a big war to be fought, a war on fire. And that took agility. It took really fresh thinking. And we all saw it through the news that within 3 days, the Australian Reserve Force was mobilised and deployed on home soil. So there was much less of what you would consider normal policy if we were to send people off into a theatre of war. But that took a willingness from all involved to do whatever's necessary, even if it's not the usual way. And that's a risk-based approach to governance, where you have to accept that there are risks in agility, in being agile, in agile governance. But I wasn't worried, because all around me and all around us are people that want to do the right thing. They actually want to serve their country, and they want to save lives, from the public servants to those that are out there on the front line. So even if myself or anyone else in public service gets it wrong in these situations, it's not, I don't think, because we're trying or not trying to do good. It's because we want to do good. And I think this could be a fundamental condition of agile governance. Is this for the greater good? But had it not been for a war on fire, you know, local villages and townspeople wouldn't ordinarily accept military driving down the road, or their privacy or freedom of movement being challenged. So no sooner had the fire come under control than we all started hearing of a mysterious SARS-like disease taking off. And in fact, you know, going back to the mid-2000s, there's predictions of another pandemic or, you know, breakouts, outbreaks. And we all know of the Spanish flu. So I personally knew it wasn't unprecedented. It was actually to be expected. I was just a little surprised that it happened when it did. So that's why I was the first person to go down to the supermarket and buy a jumbo size toilet roll pack. And yes, folks, I confess it was me. I did actually start the panic buying. But actually, without consent, what happened was rations were imposed upon us all. And we accepted them. Desperate times call for desperate measures. And more gravely, we started to see data about lives lost coming in from all over the world. And we all started to become armchair epidemiologists. We all wanted data. We wanted more data, no matter what the privacy implications. You wanted to know, I wanted to know, am I safe? And then the governance over our lives has got even more agile, if you like. And I don't know whether you think it's a good or a bad thing, but from my perspective, it really bit into our own lives. And we face this new reality of what's been called social distancing, and now we call physical distancing, fortunately. But once again, our lives depended on data. We consented to sacrificing our liberty for the greater good, but we didn't actually sign or tick a box. And as you know, countries around the world all took different approaches, and they've had moments of success and sometimes moments of relapse. I remember seeing South Korea's approach, and the fact that they had contact tracing driven by mass surveillance. And the residents of South Korea were fully aware of this mass surveillance. And they were saying things like, it's a violation against privacy, but it is necessary. And this tells you something about agile governance. In other countries, facial recognition is in operation all the time. So contact tracing is easy because the citizens, either willingly or unwillingly, have decided to accept living in a country where the model is that the government is always watching over them. And in the case of a pandemic, that's great because it's not to punish you, but to protect you. But in Australia, we took this opt-in model once again. And I think we were essentially admonished, if I can paraphrase, that if you all get the COVID Safe app, you can have your freedom back. I mean, no one actually said that, but that's kind of the feeling that you get. So here we see the model and idea of data governance is wildly varied in an emergency or when the safety of lives depend on data. So this need for agility could be driven from either the user's expectations or the controller's needs. And in any case, the traditional model of data governance will, in a time of crisis, likely not be fit for purpose. So we're required to stop thinking in terms of you can't do that, which is a very typical governance perspective, to you can if ... And we have to think in that way. Singapore's already deployed a robot dog, which apparently enforces social distancing of people in parks by making sure people are apart from each other, physical distancing, I should say. But elsewhere, there are technologies now available as we push the envelope into the near future, whereby surveillance drones can continuously monitor crowds, measuring their temperature and distance from each other, potentially even using facial recognition. But if I'm in a crowd, what if I don't consent to that? Is it a good thing? But then again, would you and your family want to know that the person next to you at the traffic lights at a pedestrian crossing has a fever? Well, you kind of would want to know that. You want to, again, protect your life and those of those you love. So there's a balance in all cases. And decision-making about personal data use comes down to these simple pros and cons, acknowledging that my pros and cons of today might not be the same tomorrow. I mean, if I'm being held at gunpoint, the pros and cons suddenly change dramatically. So now what I'm going to do is leave you with a couple of ideas for agile data governance, and then we're going to open up for comments and thoughts and questions. So firstly, anyone would feel pretty comfortable stepping into this pool of water. It's pretty good. There's no surprises. It's clear, it's transparent, and I can clearly evaluate the risk. So first point, transparency is key to agile governance and consent when lives depend on data. So yesterday I opened up Twitter and a pop-up window said, we're changing our terms and conditions. It took up half the screen. Sure, there was a find out more link, but I actually just clicked I agree to get the blockage off my screen. Is that transparent, informed consent? I really don't think it is, actually. Show people the pros and the cons, show the benefits versus the risks. So, that looks like a lot of fun, not without risk. And when I was much younger, I went parachuting, skydiving. It was free fall skydiving, which means you get trained for a day, and then the next day you jump out of a plane. The first hour of the training was all about telling us every single person in Australia whether the person had died from parachuting and why. Now, understanding those risks made us listen very, very closely. Another principle is to give practical examples. So we're collecting your data to look after you, but we would like this data to also be used for research, and explain to the people what the difference is between primary purpose versus secondary use. Most people in Australia don't know the difference, so we need to give it a practical illustration, a scenario-based illustration that helps them to think, yeah, you know what, that's not a bad idea. It would be great if my data could help somebody else. You know, some things are optional and some things are mandatory. So it is possible for me to buy a smart TV and for it to say this is essential, but I should also have options. Options should be available to me. And so you can see in this image, there's a variety of different pieces of protective equipment. Not all of it's necessary, but some of it should be for safety. Think about your policy or your data consent in an emergency based on everything we've been talking about. How does it change? So do I have one set of preferences for everyday life, business as usual, but then another set of preferences for when I'm in an emergency? I actually do. I just don't know what they are yet. And I've never been given the chance to think about it. We talked about graceful degradation, depending on the options. So just because I don't want to, for instance, connect my cameras to my smart home, maybe I do want to connect my microwave. Or more importantly, what happens if I don't have Wi-Fi? Can I have a smart home? So again, we need to think about graceful degradation. We also need to think about continuous monitoring of consent. It's not something that you set and forget. It's not a tick of a box and then thereafter you've got my consent. We need to adapt and think about the fact that systems can and should keep track of my current thinking on consent. And finally, you might even simplify it to having a slider. And that slider might be between risk and benefit, or privacy and convenience. It might be a way of me simplifying all of my decisions to how important is risk or benefit to me. Lastly, have a couple of different gears for policy development. We saw this year very fast policy development, which was fantastic. But if you did policy development like that all the time, inevitably things would fall through the cracks. Not only that, you would suffer burnout, as would your organization. So we can have long, good, solid policy development and governance, but we also need to know when and how we should do agile policy governance development. So here's these dot points now. I don't actually like dot points, but it just wraps up some of the concepts. How about a transparent scenario-based consent form for someone, where they can clearly see what are the different scenarios under which my data might be used? What about giving people some simple pros versus cons? That this is what we could do if you did this scenario, but this is what would be beneficial to you. Examples, illustrations. Consider optional versus mandatory consent. Consider in an emergency, how does it change? And especially consider, just because I don't tick a box doesn't mean it's all or nothing. Consider continuous monitoring of consent. There's probably an app for that. If there's not, we should all be making those sorts of apps. I see businesses and enterprises popping up around the world, such as Humanity.co, My31, Decenter, others which are permissions managers, and they're looking at creating brokerage out of personal data. Let's see. There is a spectrum of consent, and we should acknowledge that. So what is the slider model for your particular situation? And can we have a bimodal or multi-gear policy development framework and know which one we're working under at which time? All right, good. We've come to the end of the presentation, a little longer than I'd hoped. And I trust that that's created some interesting thoughts. And so what I'd like to do now is open up for others to comment and share their own personal thoughts on this. And to do that, Andrew, do you need control? Or shall I look for hands in the attendees section? I don't see anything coming through. I will go to the Q&A, comments, chat. Here we go. So a couple of people have commented. Belinda Newham has said, consent equals a decision. Trade-off between various benefits and risks. COVID-safe app promos seem to oversimplify this trade-off and didn't identify both the tangible and intangible risks and benefits. It's not binary. Need more sophisticated consent process so people can make informed decisions. Yeah, I think so. And one of the challenges of public communication, which inevitably quite a few of us are aware of, is that how do you get a message distilled down in a format that people can understand and make a decision on? So I think you've got a really good point there. We need to give people the information they need. Now, call-in user 1 is requesting to speak, so I'm going to allow to talk and trust that you can now speak. Anyone there? You have to unmute me. Yeah, apologies. What I'm going to do, Andrew, is hand back the controls to you so that you can take charge of the moderation. Apologies all. Okay. Andrew, you are unmuted.
Okay. Sorry.
Thank you.
Some delay. So yeah, so there's a few more things that come through. So there's a question for Greg about they could change the name from COVID safe to COVID trace. It's a comment for David. Jason says, consider the theorists, of which I'm not one, have often made fun of their paranoid positions on the use of data. They tend to have good points scattered in their thoughts, but these can be lost in delivering their message. I feel that many people often are unaware of the data currently held on them and the potential uses of the data. What's your view on aggregating data holdings and how that could be managed? Is it possible to have an overarching governance framework, and is this simple to achieve, or is it simply unachievable?
I think that's a great question. I actually think that we have a lot more work to do in understanding what happens to data when you aggregate it, when you augment it. I think that, for example, sometimes innocuous, de-identified data, when it is re-aggregated, might have security implications. It might tell a story that is important. And so we do have work to do in data governance to understand that the level of sophistication in both manual techniques, but also automated techniques are changing what's possible. So whereas a human may not be able to identify or re-identify a person from some data, it's quite possible in this day and age with very few dimensions to use artificial intelligence or algorithmic approaches to re-identify. So I'm looking for innovations and thinking about the future that helps to look at that whole data lifecycle and understand that it's not just that initial consent, but it's the multiple purposes that come from those aggregation. So I also tend to agree with you that there's an element of truth even within any kind of paranoia. People don't come to these opinions without any kind of background concern. And I think rather than disregard them, we should be thinking about, well, why does this cohort of people think this way? And how can we appropriately address this concern? And I know for myself, when I'm working on the organizational side of governance, it's all about rules and I can see how I want to set things. But when I think from the consumer's perspective, the citizen, the person who has to relinquish their data, then I'm almost a different person. And so the challenge for us in our design thinking of systems and of consent and of data governance is to put ourselves in the shoes of the person whose data we're looking to take hold of.
There's another comment from Belinda. Another thought. Consent to use my data when it will save my life is further complicated when there are multi-agency access arrangements and responsibilities. It is difficult to air gap between law enforcement, emergency management, and intelligence information systems.
It is very difficult. And so how do we approach that? Is it about a national conversation to change the expectation of the way data is used across whole of government? Or is it about building these gaps and giving people the assurances that one thing can't affect another? And I think one country that is often cited as a good example is Estonia, whereby back in the 90s, essentially rebuilding the whole country, they opted for a pretty much fully digital approach to data. And one of the things that I liked about the model was write once, read many. So only one institution or department across the government would have my residential home address rather than it being duplicated across many different data sets. And so all government departments and agencies access all data to build a consolidated picture, which, as you can imagine, creates a framework for fantastic citizen services and making sure that you're not allowing people to fall through the gaps. But we have to remember culturally, it's very different over there to, for instance, the culture in Australia. And so I actually believe that the national conversation about this will come about as a result of work of the Australian National Data Commissioner, the Office of the National Data Commissioner, and new bits of legislation like the Data Availability and Transparency Act, which is in consultation. So Australia's got I think a risk-averse history as a general population, but these are very good questions and very good conversations that we need to have. And we can't just dumb it down to something simple, and we especially can't make it feel to any individual like they're somehow being conned into giving across their data.
So there's a comment from Roger about my concern is the use of my personal data to determine the price I pay for a product.
Yes, very, very interesting. And this is why I think some organizations and startups and enterprises are looking at blockchain and looking at, could we not as individuals potentially have control of the brokerage of our personal information? And there are explorations into economic models for how it might be possible to be at the center of deciding who gets my information and on what terms, and how am I remunerated or in other ways given some sort of benefit to warrant that exchange. I think, you know, there is always an economic exchange taking place. When you sign up for Facebook, there is a give and a take. I just don't know that we necessarily have got the transparency right about the take versus the give at the moment.
Okay, so there's a question here from Nishta. I feel there's also another part of data governance to consider as to when data is not needed anymore. For example, what happens to the COVID safe data when we've completely eradicated the virus?
Yeah, it's again a great question, and this speaks to those of you on the call that work in data governance and think in terms of data lifecycle. A really interesting problem that our National Archives of Australia are trying to solve is how do you create a collective memory of Australia when everybody's going digital? Now, you might have dropped your mobile phone into the toilet basin and your phone has lost all its data. There may have been information on that phone that was important to the national interest, to preserving the history of Australia. So we've got we've got new territory that we need to cover. And one of the challenges, I'm not speaking on behalf of National Archives, but I know that their legislation is also up for reform because we need to adjust to this life that we have now with so much transient data. Not sure if that answers the question. I've just done a bit of a ramble. So
there's a few more coming in. So this is from Sean. Do you have any advice on data storage in the cloud where PPPI can be stored outside Australia if not locally requested?
I'd probably prefer to steer away from that one because I think it's very specific to the situation. You know, certain circumstances that would be prohibited, but in others it may or may not be possible. So I think that's a more complex question that requires sort of situation-specific advice.
There's one from Dan. Hi Paul, you raised some very good points. I agree with the constant consent monitoring and reminders, especially when it's a return to new post-COVID world. How do we as a nation keep at the forefront of everyday Australians and government policymakers to continue moving forward and not rolling back to old norms? Individual choice will always remain. I'm mindful of the commitments also to the 73rd WHO Assembly to be prepared, to be better prepared.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of people, I hope that the disruptions that we're seeing now through COVID and even the Black Summer bring about lasting change. I personally believe that these disruptions, in fact, disruptions can happen by any number of means, as you would well know, you know, from a bloody revolution to a peaceful transformation to, you know, a health pandemic, world wars. You know, we know that, for example, in the Second World War, women were working on the assembly lines, building planes and weapons and such like. And then at the end of the war, clearly they weren't thinking, well, now I want to, they wanted to keep working. It was a transformative thing. It was for the betterment of humanity, as was the commercialization of aviation. So I kind of live in hope that what we're going through now is creating some new norms or some new innovations, or is piquing the interest of different groups to think about, hang on, we don't want to go back to the way things were. We actually want to design the future. And those of you on the call, and I don't mean this as flattery, you are the people that will design the future. You're the people that take these ideas and this sort of thinking and start to challenge the status quo.
So just time for one or two more. So should everyone get a voice in shaping, influencing governance or policy, like in the democracy example? If so, do we need to have a notion of respect in voicing our opinion to avoid the trolls?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is about the human condition, and to which I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think that it's good for people to have a voice. It's why we vote. The voting that we do right now gives us a form of democracy, which is fantastic. But I also think that, a bit like this consent concept, your personal opinions and your preferences do change over time. So it's important that we start to design systems that allow individuals to have a voice, if that's appropriate. Yes, to have respect for those voices, but I think the way we show respect for people's voices is by giving them a mechanism to show their consent or their voice, to put a check in a box. And that's a personal opinion. I do think that there is a way for us to design systems that allow permutations and combinations and variables and factors so that we get a much better representation across what people really think about something.
Okay, so, there's one more comment here from Lee. One method of making health data sharing more palatable is to mandate it cannot be used for compliance purposes. However, there are times where this is a grey area. For example, when a medical device fails, that patient's information needs to be shared for both health and compliance reasons. So it may be worth considering moving forward.
Yes, and I think depending on the organisation, there are often provisions for clinical assurance that are not, I don't mean this to sound like a loophole, but they sort of bypass, or they're exceptional. And in fact, even as you would know in the privacy principles, that there are times where it says except or unless expressly permitted by law. So some laws allow that, and laws around safety, for example, can allow that. Medical devices is a really interesting area, just in terms of security in an age of cyber attacks. But I think, yeah, it really just does come down to what's for the greater good, and perhaps we need to design a few more principles around what that actually means in the case of personal data or device data.
So one last question from David. Thanks, Paul, for the excellent session. Your thoughts on a default personal information standard and digital privacy preferences for each citizen? Something where the variables are transparent, owned and managed by the individual and used by the government.
Yes.
Could include emergency preferences as well.
Yeah, I think that is the kind of approach that is practicable. So, you know, when the My Health record went from opt-in to opt-out, you could say with a broad brush that it was creating a default position for everybody, which you had certain levers that you could use to express a different view. I think if you are going to create default positions on privacy or preferences, it needs to be still informed. You know, we need people to understand what that means for them. And I think this comes back to one of those principles of pros and cons.
Okay, well, I think that's all we have time for, Paul. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And I hope we can get you back another time to talk a bit more on this topic.
It was a pleasure. I hope people have got some thoughts from this that they can evolve and build on going forward.
Okay. So I'd just like to bring everyone's attention to the next Dharma webinar for the IAM, which is next Tuesday. And it's on discovering and accessing Geoscience Australia's data and publications by Margie Smith. So if you've got time next Tuesday at 12 o'clock, please join us. Okay, thank you, everybody. We'll leave the session now.